At the final stage of World War II, when German industry was rapidly losing its capacity to sustain the prolonged conflict, strange reports began to surface from across central Germany about objects hidden deep underground. Engineering units, tasked with clearing transportation hubs and repairing damaged communications, occasionally encountered anomalies such as ground subsidence, empty spaces beneath rock formations, or echoes of long-forgotten underground operations. In the midst of general chaos, such findings were not particularly surprising. However, one such signal led to an event that would later be known informally as the unexpected fortress. In the early spring of 1945, a team of German engineers was dispatched to the Thuringian forest to investigate an area where several minor landslides had occurred. According to the official maps, the area was simply a forested zone with no significant infrastructure. However, the first geological surveys revealed considerable discrepancies. Beneath the ground, the presence of massive voids was detected, as though an enormous architectural complex was hidden within the forest. The team began their work by carefully mapping the area. They employed the available methods of passive acoustics and mechanical probing, which allowed them to approximate the boundaries of the unknown structure. The measurements were so large that they didn't align with any known projects. The chief engineer suggested it might be the remnants of an old mining complex abandoned before the war, but the absence of any surface exits contradicted this theory. After several days of searching, the engineers discovered an entrance, hidden beneath a layer of moss, roots, and rocks. It was a massive metal hatch, embedded in an inclined concrete slab. Its surface was covered with corrosion, but it still bore signs of industrial processing typical for large-scale military sites. Judging by its design, the hatch had been sealed from the inside and was intended for long-term hermetic sealing. Following orders, the engineers began to open it. When the hatch finally gave way, they were met with a rush of cold air coming from deep below. The air smelled of rust, limestone, and stagnant moisture. The beam of their flashlights illuminated a long, sloping tunnel that descended at a sharp angle. The walls were lined with reinforced concrete, typical of late-war German constructions meant to shield industrial production from airstrikes. The descent took about an hour. The tunnel seemed endless, and its height allowed small vehicles to pass through. This struck them as odd. If the object was built in secret, its scale appeared to far exceed typical underground workshops. Finally, the tunnel led to a massive chamber, half submerged in darkness. The ceiling seemed to disappear into the shadows, supported by rows of thick columns. The echo of their footsteps reverberated, as if they had entered a stone cathedral. The hall was empty. There was no equipment, no signs of personnel, only concrete, steel, and silence. It seemed as if the complex had either been unfinished or abandoned long before it was expected to be. The floor showed marks left by machinery, likely heavy transport platforms or vehicles, but all the equipment had been removed, as if someone had prepared the site for evacuation. The engineers continued their examination. They found 3 side corridors, each leading to separate sections. The first section resembled a network of smaller passages and rooms, possibly intended for administrative or living purposes. The walls displayed remnants of cable fixtures, though the cables had been carefully removed. The second section seemed to be a technical area. There were empty concrete tanks, possibly meant for storing fuel or cooling liquids. The third section would become the focus of their interest. It was a colossal workshop, more than 100 meters long. The floor showed the remains of rail tracks, and the walls bore marks from heavy lifting systems. The scale of the area was so large that the engineers concluded it had been intended for the assembly or maintenance of something large, possibly experimental machinery. The question arose, why was such an ambitious project abandoned almost entirely? And more importantly, why had no official records been found regarding its existence? Many engineering projects late in the war were conducted in secrecy, but this facility required enormous resources. Thousands of tons of concrete, hundreds of workers, complex logistical chains. Hiding such a facility would have been extremely difficult, even under strict confidentiality. Over the following day, ventilation shafts, communication channels, and waterproofing systems were checked. Everything indicated that the complex had been designed for long-term autonomous operation. It could function for months without external supplies, as evidenced by the presence of large water reservoirs and independent air filtration systems. It appeared to be an underground fortress, not in the traditional military sense, but as a hidden industrial and research complex. However, the main question remained: why was it built? And why had it been abandoned? The discovery of the massive underground facility deep within the Thuringian forest was only the beginning. Over the following days, the engineers became increasingly absorbed in the mystery of what they had stumbled upon. The complexity of the structure suggested a level of sophistication far beyond conventional military or industrial needs. Every inch of the facility seemed to have been meticulously planned. But who had constructed it, and for what purpose, was still unclear. After exploring the initial chambers, the team moved deeper into the complex, examining each of the 3 side corridors. The most striking aspect of the facility was its scale. Unlike the typical underground workshops the engineers had encountered in other locations, this site was vast, capable of housing entire battalions of workers and machinery. The ceilings were high, and the walls bore intricate reinforcement patterns that suggested an effort to protect not just against airstrikes, but from artillery and even bombing raids. Some of the engineers began to speculate that the site was designed not just for production, but as a fortified base, hidden from view for both safety and secrecy. Despite its size, the facility appeared abandoned. Not a single piece of equipment remained. The only evidence of prior activity was the occasional rusted metal crate or a stack of old wooden pallets. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of a place long forsaken. However, there was an unsettling sense of order to the emptiness. It was as if the workers had left in a hurry but left nothing behind. No signs of panic, no unfinished work, no rushed evacuation. In one of the chambers, they found a large, reinforced door that appeared to lead to yet another section of the facility. The door was sealed tight, but the engineers had brought explosives with them for just such an occasion. After carefully setting the charges, they detonated them, clearing the way for entry. Beyond the door lay an even more expansive section of the complex. This part was eerily silent, the walls smooth and without decoration, as though designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding earth. There were no windows, no air vents, and no obvious source of light. The engineers ventured further in, shining their flashlights into the gloom. What they found was beyond anything they had expected. Massive chambers lined with rows of heavy-duty machines, many of which appeared to be in mid-production. However, most of them had been deactivated, their motors silent and still. What struck the engineers as odd was the nature of the equipment. Some of the machines appeared to be designed for assembly, but their purpose was unclear. Others seemed like research devices, complex and far ahead of their time. But there was no indication of what they had been intended to produce or test. It was as if the entire operation had been abandoned on the brink of completion. In the heart of the facility, the team discovered a massive chamber with several large cylindrical tanks. They were connected to a series of pipes and ducts, suggesting they were part of a larger, interconnected system. But the tanks were empty, and the pipes lay dormant. What could have been stored in these enormous containers? The sheer size of the space suggested a project of unimaginable scope. As the engineers continued their investigation, they began to piece together fragments of information. In one corner of the chamber, they found what appeared to be a series of crude sketches on the wall, hastily drawn in chalk. The sketches depicted a series of diagrams, strange, incomprehensible designs that none of the engineers could immediately identify. Some were drawn with such precision that it was clear they had been the work of highly skilled technicians. But what they depicted was a mystery. It was becoming increasingly apparent that the facility had been designed for something much more than ordinary military production. The secrecy surrounding it, the scale, and the complexity of the structure all pointed to a top-secret project, one that had likely been intended to push the boundaries of technology and warfare. But what happened to it? Why had it been abandoned so suddenly? And most importantly, who had been responsible for its construction? Despite the mounting questions, there were no answers in the facility itself. No documents, no records, and no people. Everything pointed to a deliberate, strategic abandonment, an operation that had been stopped abruptly, leaving behind only the echoes of what had once been. The engineers could not help but feel a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just a factory or a research lab. It was a lost piece of history, a relic of a time when Germany had been at the forefront of technological innovation, but one that had been left behind in the rush to escape the inevitable. As the team prepared to leave the site, one engineer discovered a final hidden compartment deep within the structure. This compartment was small, but inside they found a series of metal files locked away in a secure cabinet. These files were the first tangible evidence they had found that might shed light on the purpose of the complex. The papers inside were heavily classified, bearing the insignia of the highest levels of the German military. But the documents were incomplete and cryptic, offering little insight into the true nature of the project. Only a few sketches and notes remained, alluding to a new weapon or superior technology. The discovery left them with more questions than answers. What had been the true purpose of this underground fortress? Why had it been abandoned? And who had been behind it? These questions lingered in the minds of the engineers as they left the Thuringian forest, unaware that their discovery would one day become part of a much larger, much darker story. As the engineers continued their exploration of the abandoned underground facility, the mystery deepened. The vast complex, seemingly constructed for purposes far beyond ordinary military needs, had a cold, almost clinical atmosphere. Every corner of the facility seemed to hint at something grand, yet its purpose remained elusive. Whatever had been intended to be produced here was still a question that loomed over the site, one that no amount of investigation seemed to answer fully. The discovery of the metal files in the hidden compartment marked a pivotal moment. The documents inside were highly classified, marked with the insignia of top-tier military officials. The engineers quickly realized that they had stumbled upon a piece of history that was far more significant than they could have imagined. The notes and sketches within the files, though cryptic, seemed to allude to a new weapon or superior technology, an invention of unimaginable scale and power, possibly far beyond anything the world had seen at the time. One of the engineers, having examined the files closely, believed they had identified references to experimental weaponry, something that could potentially change the course of the war. The sketches depicted strange mechanical structures that seemed designed to harness enormous amounts of energy, far beyond the capacity of anything Germany had been known to produce at that point. Some designs suggested the use of advanced propulsion systems, while others appeared to be related to weapons of mass destruction. But there were no details, only vague references and incomplete schematics. The pieces of the puzzle simply didn't fit together. This discovery led the engineers to question the role of this underground fortress even further. If it was truly designed to develop new, advanced technology, why had it been abandoned so suddenly? Had it been a last-ditch effort to turn the tide of the war? Or was it something more sinister? an attempt to develop a weapon that could alter the balance of global power forever. The engineers revisited the tanks and massive chambers they had found earlier. Now, with the knowledge from the files, the engineers began to consider a different possibility. The tanks, pipes, and advanced machinery weren't just part of a factory. They might have been intended for something more experimental. Perhaps the facility had been designed to house and test weapons that were too dangerous to be deployed in the open. Or perhaps the tanks had been designed to store materials for a new type of explosive, something more powerful and destructive than anything seen before. As they moved deeper into the complex, one engineer discovered an anomaly in the layout of the underground halls. One section of the facility seemed completely isolated from the rest, sealed off with thick concrete walls and an array of security measures that made it nearly impossible to access. The engineer, growing more intrigued by the mystery, began working to breach this final barrier. When they finally managed to break through, they found a room unlike any other in the facility. The walls were lined with metallic sheets, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, as though no one had stepped foot in the room for years. The air felt colder here, more sterile. At the center of the room stood a massive structure, partially obscured by a large tarp. It was clear that this was the heart of the facility. Whatever it was, it had been designed with the utmost care. The engineers approached cautiously, pulling away the tarp to reveal a large, cylindrical object. Its surface was smooth and metallic, with intricate patterns etched into its exterior. The shape was unfamiliar, not resembling any weapon or machine the engineers had seen before. It was clear that this was no ordinary piece of technology. Some of the engineers suggested that it might be a new type of rocket or an advanced bomb, but no one could say for sure. The designs they had found earlier seemed to match the structure, but the true purpose of the object remained unclear. As they studied the object, the sense of unease among the engineers grew. It was as if they were standing before something far more dangerous than they had first realized. This was no ordinary experimental technology. This was a weapon of that, they were certain. But its true nature and the reason for its existence remained shrouded in secrecy. Days passed, and the engineers' obsession with the facility grew. They spent hours poring over every scrap of information they could find, analyzing the remaining sketches and notes, trying to make sense of the incomplete designs. The deeper they dug, the more questions arose. Why had the project been abandoned so suddenly? Had the German military realized too late that the technology they were developing was too powerful, too dangerous? Or had something else occurred, something that led to the destruction of the entire operation? Theories abounded, but none seemed to explain the true nature of the facility. Some engineers speculated that the project had been part of a desperate effort to create a superweapon that could turn the tide of the war. Others believed it was an attempt to create a new form of energy or a revolutionary weapon system. But one thing became clear. This facility, abandoned in the final days of the war, was no ordinary underground complex. It was a place where the most advanced and possibly the most dangerous technology had been developed. But the ultimate purpose of this project, whether for good or ill, remained locked away in the shadows of history. As the engineers prepared to leave the facility, the sense of mystery continued to haunt them. What had they uncovered? What had the Nazis been trying to build here? And why had they abandoned it? The answers remained out of reach, lost to the world, along with the remnants of the Third Reich. The engineers' findings from the abandoned underground complex in the Thuringian forest became a source of ongoing intrigue. Despite the many unanswered questions, one thing was clear. This facility had been built for a purpose far greater than simple wartime production. Its scale and secrecy pointed to something monumental, something that could have altered the course of the war or even the future of warfare itself. But the questions surrounding its abandonment remained unanswered. After their initial investigation, the engineers returned to the surface to report their findings to higher-ups. The metal files they had found contained tantalizing but incomplete information, pointing to a new weapon that was still shrouded in mystery. The designs and sketches inside the files alluded to a superweapon of extraordinary power, but the details were vague, almost deliberately obscured. The engineers had no way of knowing if these weapons were ever built, or if they were simply a fevered ambition to create something beyond the technological limits of the time. Despite their inability to uncover the true purpose of the underground facility, the engineers were certain of one thing: the Nazi regime had invested heavily in this secret project. The complexity of the facility, the scale of its construction, and the advanced technology it housed all pointed to a grand ambition, an effort to develop a weapon that could tip the scales of war in their favor. Whether the Nazis had been successful in creating such a weapon was still unknown, but the very existence of the complex was a testament to their desperate final attempts. In the weeks that followed, the engineers returned several times to the facility, hoping to discover more clues. Each visit only deepened the sense of mystery. The facility was eerily quiet, with no sign of life. The equipment was long gone, but the massive, cold structure stood as a haunting reminder of what had been attempted there. One of the engineers, feeling increasingly obsessed with the site, decided to conduct a more detailed examination of the object they had uncovered in the final room. The large, cylindrical structure covered by a tarp. With the others away on another assignment, he ventured into the facility alone, determined to uncover its secrets. As he approached the object, the sense of dread grew. This was the key, he felt. Whatever the object was, it had to be the focal point of the entire project. The cylindrical shape was unlike anything he had seen before. Smooth, metallic, and covered in intricate engravings. He studied it closely, hoping to find some clue that would explain its purpose. But the object remained silent, refusing to reveal its secrets. For hours, he examined it from every angle, searching for any markings, inscriptions, or other signs that might offer insight into its function. But it was clear that this object, like the rest of the facility, had been designed to be hidden from view, locked away from history. His obsession with the object grew. He began to believe that the entire facility had been constructed around this singular piece of technology. If he could understand what it was, perhaps he could unlock the answers that had eluded the other engineers. But as the days passed, he found himself more and more isolated from the rest of the team. His fixation on the object drove him to work late into the night, combing through old sketches and notes, trying to find any clue that might help him understand the object's purpose. Then, as if by chance, he discovered something. A single, incomplete diagram in one of the old files caught his attention. It was a rough sketch of a similar cylindrical structure, but this time, there were annotations. The diagram suggested that the object might be part of a larger system, a weapon or device designed to harness energy in ways that had never been attempted before. The notes mentioned a fusion core and unlimited power, but the text was fragmented and unclear. Excited by this new revelation, the engineer returned to the facility the next day, hoping to gain more insight into the object's true nature. But when he arrived, he found that the site had already been sealed off by higher authorities. His superiors had received word of the facility's discovery and had decided that it was too dangerous to remain open. In an instant, the mystery of the underground complex was locked away once again. The engineer was left with nothing but his notes and the haunting image of the cylindrical object. Was it truly a weapon, as the diagram suggested? Or was it something more? a device that could change the course of human history. He would never know for sure. In the years that followed, the story of the Thuringian Forest Complex faded into obscurity. The site was abandoned, and its secrets were buried along with the Third Reich. The few who knew of its existence kept their silence, and the mysterious object remained locked away in the forgotten halls of the underground fortress. But the legacy of that complex, of the ambition and desperation that led to its creation, lives on. A silent reminder of the lengths to which the Nazis went in their attempt to create a superweapon that could shift the balance of power in the world. Whether the object ever became a functional weapon, or whether it was simply a dream that never came to fruition, it remains an unanswered question, locked away in the annals of history.